Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. As I always say, this is one I've been looking forward to. This particularly is because we're interviewing today a friend of mine called Steve Balsamo. Now, Steve and I have known each other for many, many years now, and we first officially met, I think it was, at an event by our mutual friend, Penny Satori, Dr. Penny Satori. And Penny Satori and I were doing a kind of similar to this, an in conversation at a Mind, Body and Spirit festival, I think, in London, round about 7 or 8 years ago. And Steve and I got chatting at that, and then we subsequently met, I think, at another event. And we found that not only has Steve had a series of quite extraordinary experiences throughout his life that are very much in support of my own Itladian concept, but on top of that, he's also had the most amazing career in music, and we share such an amazing interest in music. Without doubt, I think Steve probably mirrors my musical taste more than anybody else, because every time I post something about a band or mention a band, Steve already knows about them. And indeed, I think one of the most emotional, powerful videos I think I've ever seen on YouTube is Steve's covering with his associate, Rosalie Dayton. And it's a cover version of a Sean Colvin song called I Don't Know Why. And if you get the chance to see that, it is incredible. And it is so moving. And the covering, it is almost as if Steve and Rosalie are actually in many ways sounding like, I would say, Graham Parsons and Emmylou Harris were in the album Grievous Angel, because the same kind of the way the voices just meld so well together. It's that kind of magical mixture where the two voices just become something incredible. And we were just discussing before we started, Steve and I, about that album and how good that album is. But check that one out, because on that album, Steve, I'm right in saying, isn't it, that you do actually have your head shaved as it happens?
That's right. In that video. And there's a tie-up as well, because when I first heard you talk, I think it was on Theo Chalmers' show a long time ago, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago. You talked about the incident with the Sean Colvin song, Another Round of Blues. And I remember, my God, somebody who's into the same stuff I'm into, but also loves Sean Colvin. This has got to be great. You know?
Absolutely.
So that
how long did it take you to grow your hair back after doing that then?
I'm quite a hirsute fella. Probably about 2 weeks and it was back. And I've only recently clapped my barnet now because it was halfway down my back again.
Very fortunate.
There's a little bit of a monkey landing pad coming on the back of these days, but I think I'm going for a comb over.
Absolutely.
So that video was great. It was a really, and it's, it sounds like a cliche, but it was liberating to cut my hair off.
Because it must have been a very strange sensation, and clearly you'd planned it, and well, obviously Rosalie didn't just pick up a pair of shears and decide to cut your hair, but
no.
It worked so well with the twist ending. I thought that the twist ending of that video was also incredibly well done. I did not see it coming at all.
Well, we won't tell anybody, just go and check it out. But yeah, I got to meet Sean because I did a version of, and Sean Colvin, if nobody knows, is an amazing kind of folk country singer-songwriter, just made many, many brilliant albums. And when I was signed to Sony, I did a cover of I Don't Know Why on a solo album, and we managed to get Sean to come and, so there's another version of Sean and I duetting, which was great as well. But that's a whole other story. And
I would love to hear that.
I'll send it to you later.
Please.
She was such a sweetheart. And my girlfriend, now my wife, who doesn't come to studios or anything, she came that day and said, I'm coming to the studio to meet Sean. And she was such a sweetheart. It was great.
And did you do that over in the States, or did you do it over here?
We did it here in Angel Studios in London. I think Angel's gone now, but we did it over here. And it was such a, because I'm such a big fan, and I wanted to bring all my records and get it to sign, and I didn't. And she said, you should have. I was like, oh God, I couldn't come and say, hi, Sean, and be all fanboyish to somebody, anyway. But she was a sweetheart, and
That's the
still
difficult one, isn't she? I mean, the video she did on Round of Blues, was superb as well. She's just amazing in that. It's an amazing video, but it's just the rhythm of that song is just extraordinary as well. And I think that's the cleverness of a lot of Sean Colvin's music, is the way she plays with rhythm. I find it quite extraordinary, and I've got all of her CDs. And of course, it's tragic, isn't it, that the recent death of Nancy Griffith, which broke my heart, really.
Another genius, But the story about the Round of Blues was amazing, Tony. And in fact, that interview that turned me onto your work way back when, and Theo was great. That show was a great show, actually.
He was extraordinary, wasn't it? There's two of those as well. There was the original one, and so many people have approached me of that video, and it's still available, and people can still watch it. But Theo was wonderful, and he's still a friend of mine on Facebook. He still comments quite regularly. That was an excellent program. He did so well with that. But it's not the Anthony Peake discussion, nor is it Theo. But we must get Theo on as a future guest, actually, which could be quite interesting. But it's about Steve Balsamo. So, Steve, can you tell us, how did you get into the musical world? How did it happen for you?
Well, I didn't plan to be a musician or a singer at all. And as this conversation goes on, I kind of looked to kind of synchronicities, really, to kind of guide me just in my life in general. I was in art school. And some of these stories may reappear later in different guises when I tell you some of the strangeness that I've experienced. But I was in art school and had a breakup with a girl. This is the full story. A breakup with a girl. Left the degree course that I was on. Became a piano removal man for a couple of years. And during that, started in bands. So I was late getting to music, really. I was about 19. And a friend of mine was auditioning to get into a performing arts course, my mate Johnny, and said, would I come and sing Bohemian Rhapsody for him at the college? Because he needed a singer. He was auditioning as a guitarist. So I went along to help him out, sang Bohemian Rhapsody, and Alan Good passed away a few years ago, love him. He said, you sound great, and so do you. Why don't you both come in? So I joined a performing arts course at Neath. And it was, to be honest, more about drinking pints of Strongbow at the Dark Arch in Leith Town Centre rather than learning anything about any music. But we had a great few months, and they did a college version of Superstar and cast me as Jesus. And I'd heard Superstar years before, which is a story we'll get into later, when I was in school. So I vaguely knew it, learned the part, and we'll get into that side of the esoteric stuff later. But then just after we did our little run of Superstar, I dated another girl, and she taught me some songs she was very into musicals and taught me some songs from Les Miserables. And I thought, and I still do, sound a little bit like the guy who originated the role, a beautiful Irish singer called Carl Wilkinson. I have a similar kind of falsetto high end to him in my voice. So I literally got a bus from Swansea after playing a late night gig in the infamous Wine Street in Swansea in a pub called the Coach House. I remember going up, finishing that gig, getting on a 3 o'clock train, getting to London, and being the first in line for an open audition for Les Miserables. Wired to the Moon on Coffee from McDonald's, and was the first in line, got on stage and sang the kind of big song, Bring Him Home from Les Mis, which again is like a cardinal sin when you're auditioning for a show. You don't sing the song with the lead guy when you're like 19 years of age. Anyway, lied on my CV, said I'd been in musicals and said I'd seen loads of things, said I was in Fiddler on the Roof, and to this day I still am seen up being in Fiddler on the Roof. So the guy came up on stage, and it was like a classic kind of, as you see in the films, audition scenario where there were lights on a table way in the auditorium, and I was on a stage. It was all very new to me. I didn't know anything about this at all. Literally coming from a bar where people were fighting onto a stage. It was a bit of a culture shock. Anyway, sang this song. The guy came up. He said, yeah, that's good. Have you got anything else? I said, yeah, I got this song from Jesus Christ Superstar. Do you know it? He says, yes, of course we do. So I sang that, and literally I was taken to a room and met a few of the kind of production people, and I got into the first tour and production of Les Mis. So that was I I had 3 months in performing arts school.
Had you been trained to sing? Had you been trained to sing?
No,
right.
No training at all. Over the years, I've had vocal lessons to make sure as you get older, everything drops, including your voice. So just to make sure it was all, in good shape, and luckily, touch wood, it has been. So so my training literally was on the job in a touring production of Les Mis, which was literally from a boy from Swansea, was in a rock and roll band, was like joining the circus. It was stuff,
wow,
I'd never seen before, but it was a brilliant training. And I came back then, they were going on to cast for a show called Martin Guerre, which ran in the West End for a while. And everybody had like an automatic kind of shoehorn audition for Martin Guerre at the end. And I remember it was like an exit interview. They said, "Oh, are you going to come and audition for?" And I was like, "Nah, you're all right. I'm going back to Swansea to put my band back together," which is what I did. I came back and I carried on songwriting. A few years later, a guy from the cast had become an agent himself, because he was sick of people saying agents are a pain in the you-know-what. So he became an agent himself, became a brilliant one. And he called me, and well, this is what happened. This is kind of the beginning of the kind of strangeness with this part of the story. My brother called me and said, this particular day, and said, "Hey, I've just seen Angela Weber on the telly. They're looking for a Jesus." And I was like, okay. Then Johnny called me, this guy who'd become an agent, that same day, and said, "Hey, they're auditioning for Jesus. Do you still know that song?" I was like, "Kind of. That's a funny coincidence." And then my late father-in-law called, when I went around to see him, he had a postcard from one of his Sunday newspapers that was telling you that Superstar was coming the next November. So all of these things kind of, and I remember looking at the postcard thinking, that's going to be me. And then began a very strange set of coincidences and synchronicities that kind of went. And I eventually landed the job after a year and 14 auditions later.
Wow.
But,
because so that's an incredible video that you do where you sing that performance, and it's had millions of viewings, which is absolutely, but you're electric. Thanks. You're electric in that. It's just an incredible performance.
That was late. So we finished, that was 96, 97. Then I went on, I got signed to Sony Records, made an album, toured the world, did loads of cool stuff. And the one from the Ahoy, I think, was 2004, 2000. So a lot of, so it was almost, because when we did the show, it was like 400 shows over the year. So literally 400 crucifixions. So, but there was a lot of life in between the end of my run there, because I was only like 26 and I was still a kid and didn't know my ass from my elbow. I still don't know my ass from my elbow, but I certainly didn't know my ass from my elbow then. But a lot of life had happened. My mum had passed away. I had a kid by that. My daughter was on the way, I think, or something like that. So a lot of life had come and gone until that performance at the Ahoy, which was a kind of a culmination of a lot of learning, and I was in. It was just the right thing. The band was correct, and the orchestra was amazing, and it was filmed beautifully. So that was one of those moments, I think. And when I look back at it now, it's almost like looking at somebody else. It was because I really wasn't there. I was there, of course I was there, and I was singing the notes, but I wasn't there as well. It's very, very odd sensation watching that back.
I think we'll come back to that, because there's so many things that we can talk. So let's go right back. One of the areas that really fascinates me is childhood experiences of the extraordinary, and why it is that children seem to be more receptive to this. And I know that you, when you were young, had a whole series of incredible experiences that started to make you realize that whatever this reality is, that there's far more to it than that. So could you spend a few minutes just telling us some of those?
Thanks, Tony. And I'll start with, I think when I wrote you a note yesterday, these are anecdotal stories. So, proving them is a strange thing. And also, I hardly ever talk about esoteric things to my friends in my close circle all the time, and people like yourself all the time. But people who know me as a musician and a singer, I hardly talk about it at all. So this is kind of my coming out party in a strange way.
I'm so honoured at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So I had my auntie Jill, who's still alive, and she's one of my favourite people on earth. She, when we were kids, would always tell us ghost stories and, you know, strange stories, synchronistic stuff that happened to her. And she used to run a pub in Swansea called, or work at a pub in Swansea called the Number 10. And it was famous back in the day because it had a big stuffed bear in the, which there's another story to that for another day, but they had this big kind of giant bear in the kind of hallway. And she used to say that that place was haunted, and there was a guy called Mr. H who ran the place, and he passed away, and she swore that she kept seeing him and hearing him and all of this. And I was about 6 or 7. My brother Andrew, Michael, my youngest brother, came. He was a happy accident, came along later. But me and Andrew were fascinated by this because she believed it. And I think this is the key. There was an adult, and my mum and dad were also very open. My dad especially was very into books by Arthur Findlay and loads of kind of stuff. He was very into kind of spiritualism, the old kind of school seance stuff. And I can get into that later on because we had a lot of experience with that as well. So I think it was important that there was a grown-up who didn't poo-poo any kind of strangeness or you know, the talk of ghosts and stuff like that. So I think it was the combination of my auntie Jill, and she'd probably listen to this, so she'd love a mention, love her, and the fact that Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out at the same time as Star Wars. So I think, and Close Encounters is still one of my favorite films, and of course later on learning about the Jacques Vallée, you know, ideas about the phenomena of possible ET contact, UAP contact, whatever the phenomena is, you know, just adds weight to it because it's such a great film and it still stands up to this day. So I think all of that kind of just blew my mind wide open. So, and we lived in a house that was kind of creepy and weird, and looking back probably was haunted if you believe in that sort of thing. So my dad used to run a country club in a little village near us called Pontydalais, near Swansea, and he used to run a country club called the Frongelli. And he basically stayed up there most of the week. And on the weekends, my mum didn't drive, and we take a bus from Swansea to this place. And Starsky and Hutch was, I'm 50 now, so Starsky and Hutch was huge on the TV at the time. And I had these 2 Starsky and Hutch action figures. Now the story I'm about to tell sounds so weird, but this is what I believe happened. So my Starsky had a black leather jacket on, and Andrew had another couple of things, and I cut the arms. Andrew's my brother. I cut the arms off the leather jacket and made it into some sort of fashionable gilet. I was into fashion even back then. So because I knew, and it was mine. A friend next door had Marcus, our childhood friend. He had the same one, so I did it to kind of distinguish. So this one Friday after school, we were heading on up, and I said to my mum, "Can we take the Starsky?" And she said, "Oh no, you've got plenty of toys up at the place. You don't need to take any more." And I said, "Okay." And I remember in my mind's eye and in my memory, and I know memory can be quite malleable, but I remember putting them back underneath the stairs in the toy box that we had in the cupboard. We get the bus, we go to the place, I go to the room, the 2 figures were on the bed in the place. And I can remember the feeling I had, just being, and I was the first one into the room, because I've reframed it in my mind over the years and thought, well, maybe I took them and just lied to myself, and that lie has become my memory. Maybe my brother took them, maybe my mother took them. My mother came in and said, "I told you not to give me a row. I told you not to bring them. You got plenty." I said, "I didn't bring them." She's like, "Why are you lying to me?" I'm like, "Well, I'm not lying to you." So I remember, and it sounds so weird that it's hard to even talk about it, but that actually happened. So years later, when I started to read about esoteric stuff and phenomena in the kind of parlance, that would be known as an apport, where something kind of goes from one place and goes to another. To back that up, things used to go missing in the place all the time in this place, the Frongelli. And it was a big it's like a big mansion house really, or a big 5 or 6 bedroom house in its own grounds that at the time had a bar and a dance kind of place and a restaurant. My dad was a chef. So things went missing all the time. And it was only years later that my mum and dad said, we couldn't tell you at the time. The place was weird and haunted as hell, and there was, you know, stories that we had, again, anecdotal stuff, but and there was one, you know, I shared it yesterday when I sent you some notes, Tony. There was one. The place was kind of famous for having fights between the kind of Ponta Dulais boys and the Hendy boys, and they all played rugby, and they'd come on us for Friday night, and it was mayhem. And we used to stay up there, and one night there was this, first of all, there was a storm. It's like a classic horror story. There was a storm. My Auntie Jill's, my cousin Sean, Auntie Jill's daughter Sean was with me and Andrew. We were in this particular room that had a phone that rang down to the bar area. There was a storm inside. We were watching the original King Kong on the TV. He was climbing up the Empire State Building, and I knew what was coming because I'd seen it many times, and I was about to cry. King Kong was going to die. And the phone kept ringing. The phone in the room kept ringing. And then my dad came up 3 times and said, "Stop ringing down." And we were like, "We're not touching the phone." And he said, "You are. I can hear you speaking." And he claimed that there was a voice, like a crackling voice on the line. It was like a classic flipping horror film. So the 4th time he came up and he kind of said, "Look," and was very angry and said, stop messing around." That night there was a very big fight there, and one of the bouncers got injured badly, and my dad had to go and testify in court, and a guy went to jail and all that. So because of the fighting, the next day the place was mayhem. One of the phones downstairs was ripped off the wall. It was one of those old-fashioned pay phones. So a guy from the telephone company came, whether it was BT, I can't remember what it was only a kid. He came out, and my dad told the story that my dad said, "Hey, do you want a cup of coffee?" He said, yeah. He'd gone. By the time he came back, the guy had gone, left his bag and tools and everything. So my dad had called the office, and a very embarrassed boss of this chap said, "This sounds crazy, but he saw a ghost. He isn't coming back." So there was something definitely about that place, right? And a synchronicity that I shared yesterday in a note to you, Tony, that happened recently. A friend of mine who's a singer, she lives in the area. I was talking to her about the place, and I said, "You know, I've had recurring dreams about this particular house, the Fongetli house, since I was a kid. And even up until last week, I had a dream." So this is like 40 something years later of recurring dreams and whatever. And I said, "Do you know about the place?" She said, "Oh yeah." And it turns out that her dad used to drink there as a kid. He became a detective in the police, and he was there that night that there was the big fight. So I love that synchronicity, which is crazy. And then a few years, so when my daughter was she's 16 now, so when she was about 5 or 6, so about 10 years ago, I picked her up from school and thought, I'm going to go to the Fongetli and see who lives in the house now, because I'd had a very strong recurring dream the night before about being in the house. The house had changed as they do in dreams, and there was something in the house for me. And so I took Izzy, drove up there, and when we pulled into the drive of this place, it looked like someone was living there. She started crying and saying, "Oh, I'm scared, I want to go." And I've seen too many horror films to know that I'm going to pay that some serious attention. So we got out of Dodge. So a friend of mine who was in a mediumistic group that I was part of, learning about the potential to contact deceased people or consciousnesses. I was in a group for about 5 or 6 years. A woman called Mandy, she knew the owner. So I said, "Oh, is there any chance of me being able to go and visit the place?" Obviously, don't tell her about, any recurring dreams or anything, or that I'm into kind of weird stuff, esoteric stuff. And she said, "No problem." So she arranged a meeting. So I went to see the people, and I was met with the woman who lives there now and her mum, who lived in the village. And the first thing she said to me was, "Oh, it's a heck of a coincidence. We've lived here 25 years, and nobody's ever come to visit us who lived in the house before, except last week, 2 people from Canada turned up." And I was like, "Oh, of course they did." So she showed me around, and we had a conversation. And then she said, the next thing she said was, "Oh, there's nothing here, man. There's no ghosts here." And I thought that was pretty telling. So we just had a little chat and a conversation. And she said a couple of things which made, the hairs stand up on my arms. First of all, there was a painting that they found when they were renovating the place of the people who lived there originally. And I looked at them and I felt like I knew, it was like somebody I knew. So it was very, very strange sensation. And then she said, oh, we'll probably sell this house one day. Why didn't you buy it? And then I thought, my God, maybe I will buy it. And it's been like my daemon's kind of memory, or some sort of future memory of my death. I thought maybe I'll die in the house. And I heard you speaking last week about was it Pauli guy with the 137 book? Mm-hmm. That kind of right at the end of his life. And I almost thought, when I heard that, I thought, God, that sounds like maybe I've had a future memory of the Frongetli house, that's going to be the house that I die in. Anyway, so that wasn't the end of that little coincidence. So we had a little conversation. I thanked them very much and I left. A couple of weeks ago, I was renovating the house that I live in now. And one of my builder friends cut through a wire to an alarm. So an old friend from school called Lee, who I haven't seen for ages, I called him and said, hey, can you sort the alarm out? He said, I'll be up in a minute. He sorted it out and he was having a chat and he said, God, he said, it's so strange. He said, you met my future mother-in-law next week. I said, what? And the girl that he was dating is the daughter of, and grew up in Frongetli House. And I was like, what is it? What is this? What is this thing that we're trapped in? Is it some recurring eternal return? Is it some weird quantum computer of the future that Musk and, after stealing Boston's idea, is it that? But it was such a weird, random coincidence. But that has been, and sometimes it's become funny now that they occur so much. It's like, what is going on?
Yeah, it's the argument is, and the skeptics will turn around and say, it's attention bias and it's confirmation bias when we have these clusters. But it's more than that. When you were describing that, for instance, I was being reminded all the time of J.B. Priestley's, I think it was made into James Whale did a film version of it called The Old Dark House.
I saw a play of it the other year. I saw it in London.
Whoa, because I saw a production of it in London around about five or 6 years ago. Up in
I saw that one.
The one in the pub. It's the back of the pub or something. Really?
Yeah.
How extraordinary. Whether there's a coincidence in itself, what's the chances of that?
Yeah.
Because immediately you were describing that, I was thinking, and I'll guarantee there's going to be a synchronicity here, that in J.B. Priestley's book Man and Time, you probably know that I think I'm the only person that's read through virtually all the letters he received, and there will be a whole epilogue section in my new book about these letters. I'll be describing around about 50 of them in great detail. But one of the letters that Priestley received in the early 1960s involved a hotel near Swansea, and it was a big old house. And maybe when you're chatting in a minute, I'll see if I can find the reference. And in it, he describes how this place was profoundly haunted and how the lady was describing in the letter. Now, remember, the letters were written by ordinary people responding to a request on a TV program. And she said that they were in this house and she was one of the maids in the house. And somebody dropped a jug full of either chocolate or something, molten chocolate. And she said she watched it hit the ground and then it smashed and disintegrated and all the chocolate or the liquid inside came out. And then she saw it reconfigure itself, go back up again, the liquid go back into it and it go back onto the table again. And when you were describing that, that was immediately what I was thinking about for some reason. So it was obviously a J.B. Priestley link in here. And clearly this is extraordinary. Do you know any history of the house? Do you know its background, how old it was or anything?
I think it's like 100. It's funny, I looked at it recently and I looked at who lives there now and, because it might be, I might buy it at some point. It is one of those things. I'll check it out. I'm not sure of the history of the place, but I will check it out. I remember looking online. But I will say one other thing, Anthony, as well. Liminality, of course, as we all know, plays into these phenomena. And the house, for me at the time, because we only went on the weekend, that was a liminal thing. I think because it was a bar, that's a liminal thing. People come and go. Because there was a lot of fighting going on. There was a lot of energy going on. I think that played into the phenomena. You know, maybe the house itself wasn't haunted, but certainly the aspects of it were haunted. And maybe I was as a kid as well a bit. You know, looking back, there were factors that could have played into it that made the phenomena amplify the phenomena in some way. I think, yeah. I think there were other things at play, I think, as well. You know, dodgy dealings going on in the past. You know, there was some other stuff that as a kid I wouldn't have understood at all. But looking back, you know, people having affairs and all of that sort of stuff, I found out later, would have all played into the energetic makeup of the house, and how the house may have been reacting to what was going on inside it as well. But I do feel like the house itself has always played a significant part in my life. And
well, it's funny about you describing the reoccurring dreams that you have about the house. Is that a standard part? Do you have general reoccurring dreams? And indeed, do you go back to the same place time and time again? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know there'll be people listening and they'll be intrigued by this.
The dream, the house, I've never had any recurring dreams of anything other than the house and the surrounding little garden it's got. So I'm in the house, I'm part of the house, I'm living in the house in the past. It's over the 40 years that I've had the recurring dream, it's been every conceivable configuration. The house is a different house. I've demolished the house, I've rebuilt the house. It's very interesting. There was a great book by a guy called Daniel Zanlowski. It was called The House of Leaves. I don't know if you ever read that book. I think it came out about 20 years ago. And it was, and when I read the book, I was like, my God, it's almost like it's a book within a book. It's a very complex, dense book, but it was fantastic. And one of the stories within the story is that a family move into a house, and the house is bigger on the inside than it is the outside, and they find a labyrinth in the house. And I remember when I read The House of Leaves, I thought, bloody hell, that is like this house to me. This is like a labyrinth within it, and it's just very, very strange. I don't know, man. I don't know
the way you're describing it now, and especially appearing in your dreams, it sounds quite Mansion of the Soul-y. Like you've kind of superimposed your psyche on this.
Quite possibly, yeah.
Form as well. And I guess in that time where you were there as a child, those memories are like extremely vivid. And like you say, there was probably a slight sense of threat being in that place during a weekend. Absolutely. That kept you a bit alert to the fact that there was fighting and strangers, and children would be really sensitive to that sort of thing, I think.
Well, it's interesting in this that I mean, I've just done an exercise in my own sort of eidetic memory, and I've just read down in my mind the page in J.B. Priestley, and I managed to get the name of the castle. It's called Dunraven. It's weird how I can do that. I can just visualize the page in my mind's eye, and I'll read down and I'll get it. And it's Dunraven Castle. I don't know how near it, whether we can check that, but that could be interesting. But going back, we have this, the stone theory, the stone tapes theory, that somehow things take in, walls and buildings can take in the atmosphere. But that really it's more intriguing, that, isn't it? That it's so tied into you. Yeah. And what I think is really fascinating is the way in which you go back and you've experienced it in different times and different places and different experiences. Again, I was getting visions here of a movie that I think was influenced by J.B. Priestley. I'd love to research this a little bit more, called In Dead of Night, which came out in about, the guy Johns was in it, about 1949.
Great. Is that the one with the ventriloquist?
Oh, everybody remembers that ventriloquist done with Michael Redgrave.
Oh man, that's a great film. I've got it.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And again, I was getting visions of that when you were talking about it. And I was thinking about how it is, because he does this, doesn't he? In the beginning of the movie, he wakes up, he gets in the car and he drives down, and you see him driving down the valley, and there's the house there, and he goes into the house and they start discussing déjà vu. And the idea he feels that he's been there before. And of course, what then happens is, they all tell their stories. It's one of these vignette story things. And then at the end, he's waking up, and he wakes up and he gets in the car and he's going down the valley to the house, and the shiver up your spine goes. And then weird sequence at the end where all the stories are embroiled into each other, but very priestly-esque. But again, it's the idea of these imbued memories we have. There's a lady called Esther Salomon, who in the 1950s wrote a book called A Series of Moments. And she discusses charged memories that we have. You know, those kind of memories that you have in your childhood that nothing really happened, but they're there in your mind. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not as if somebody's come to tell you that somebody's died or anything. It's just as if the recording of your life is super saturated at that point.
Yeah.
But you just wonder with you, and I think the fascinating thing is, will you buy that house? Because if you will, you know, this is intriguing. But tell us more about your child and Synchronicities. I know that Synchronicities have been a huge influence upon you. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Yeah. So not long after that, I think I was about 12. My dad was a chef. We got a job, and this begins the story of the Jesus Christ Superstar, which is another big theme that I feel I almost had to experience this time around. You know, so we moved down to Poole in Dorset at 12, which is a very difficult age to move anyway.
What year would that have been?
It would have been early 80s, I would have thought.
Okay.
Early 80s.
Okay. Okay.
Early 80s, 82, 83, something like that, for a couple of years. And during one of the, and again, it's the whole time was kind of stressful because I'd moved into a new school and all of this. So, but I remember in an RE class, I think probably during Easter, we were played the film version with Ted Neely of Jesus Christ Superstar. And I remember watching it, being weirded out that people were singing to each other. I couldn't quite get that concept. I was like, what are they doing? Because I hadn't experienced any theater at that point. And then, but seeing the fella playing Jesus, thinking, I'm going to meet that guy one day. I'm going to meet that chap somewhere down the line. So so that was a very, very strong memory. So fast forward years later, and this story is it jumps around a lot, but it's so weird and wheels within wheels, but please bear with me. I'll try and explain the best I can. So I'm in art school in Swansea doing a foundation course, and it was a boring lesson. I'm daydreaming.
By the way, can I just jump in very, very quickly just to say that Danny Torbecki in the chat room has just said House of Leaves by Danilevsk. I read this on the weekend.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, so sorry, I just thought I'd come in with that.
It's a heck of a book as well. It's about this big. It's a great book. So I'm in art school. I'm looking at the window. I kind of have this kind of daydream thing, and it's happened to me since, but never quite like this, where everything went kind of blurry, and then this kind of image of this scene kind of came over me, and I didn't know what was going on. I thought, and I, you know, at that point I've tried psychedelics later in my life, but I hadn't, no drugs, no anything was going on, and this kind of scene appeared where I was looking at myself singing in a band, and it turned out to be Meatloaf's backing band. I was a singer in Meatloaf's backing band, which is random as heck because I was into very heavy rock at the time, and Meatloaf would have been a swear word. Now, of course, I've learned the error of my ways, and he's a genius. But at the time, I was like, what? And in my mindset, and I was in the band doing backing singing. And at that time, I barely started singing. Just joined a little band, hadn't been into a recording studio properly, so I was unaware of what was going on. And as the story unfolds, you'll see where I'm getting at, but I was looking through a window of a recording studio at a band, but I didn't know at the time. So I then go to college. I then play the part, as I mentioned earlier on, of Jesus in Superstar. And we played it for a week run. And the college was kind of a sports science college, so it was full of kind of tough rugby boys who were dragged to the performances by their girlfriends. But I remember looking out in the last performance, seeing a group of these kind of rugby boys crying at the crucifixion scene. I remember giving the lines, and I remember thinking, I'm going to do this again. I'm just going to do this. So park that for a minute. So during the audition process for Jesus Christ Superstar, one of my auditions is at Abbey Road Studios. So I turn up at Abbey Road Studios, and of course I'm a Beatles fan, so it was like going to church. I go in, I'm in Studio 3, and as I get showed in by the assistant, I look through the control room window, and it's from the vision I had years before, except that it's not Meatloaf or me. I'm looking at Angela Weber and Jim Steinman, who wrote all the Meatloaf's hits and produced them. So I'm thinking, and I really felt as if I was tripping at that point, because it was so weird. And I thought, well, it's close, but it's no cigar. You know, it's kind of my vision that I had, or whatever the thing that happened. And by that point, I am a fan of, Meatloaf and Jim Steinman, so it was an honor to meet them. And they were working on a musical called Whistle Down the Wind, and they had me sing a few of the songs. I ended up singing a load of the demos, and they asked me to play the part of Jesus again, funnily enough, in the show. But I at that point had a contract with Sony Records and left. But I remember during one, I was singing the song, and Angela Weber was playing the piano really badly, and I remember thinking, have I slipped into another dimension? Because he's playing like he's got boxing gloves on, and Jim Steinman's watching me smiling, and I'm singing a song that they'd just written about Whistle Down the Wind, which incidentally was one of my favorite films as a kid. And I have this thing where I kind of almost faint. Now, at the time, I squared it in my mind as, I hadn't much to eat, and I was very nervous, and these two legends were asking me to sing these super high notes. I thought it was all that put together, and I nearly fainted. So I sat down and had a moment. Anyway, I'll come back to that. So that was that. So years later, I end up getting asked again to be in Superstar. It's a couple of years ago. So, and it's to be the alternate, if you like, to Ted Neely. Ted Neely was going to play half the week, and I played the other. So I went and I got to meet Ted, which I knew I would from when I was a kid back in the school in Poole. So we were chatting away, and we were sharing Jesus stories as you do if you'd ever worn a loincloth. So we were talking about, battle scars of playing the savior of all humanity. And I told him the story about the Meatloaf thing, and he stopped me and went, whoa, about me looking into a room and seeing me as a backing singer with Meatloaf. He went, whoa, wait a minute. He said, that was me. And I said, you are? And he said, yeah, me and Meatloaf, his name was Mike, me and Mike came from the same small town in Texas, and we both went to LA at the same time to be in the first production of Hair. He then met Jim Steinman and became Meatloaf. And I was an actor at the time, and I was trying to get a gig. I was playing gigs at the Troubadour. He was a drummer. And he said, at the time I took a job as a gardener, and I was up a tree, literally cutting this tree. And some guy went, Teddy, and this is how he was explaining it. I looked down, it was me. He said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm cutting a tree. He said, not with a voice like that. You're going to join my band. So he said, what the heck was going on? You were looking in at me? I said, oh, mate, I don't know what is going on here. That is the trippiest thing ever, right? So that was that. So a couple of years later, I end up being in a show called Notre Dame de Paris in London. And Tina Arena, great Australian singer, played Esmeralda. She left the show to carry on with the music career. And they brought in a singer called Patti Russo. And Patti Russo is the voice in I Would Do Anything for Love. And she sang backups for Meatloaf for years. So I'm here going, what kind of strange flipping loop am I in here? What is going on? So, and she's a great singer and great fun. So 6 or 7 months after I'd left the show, she calls me. She was back on tour with Meat. And she said, you'll never guess, Meat is listening to one of your songs. I'm listening to you in the tour bus now. And I'm like, huh? So one of my songs I'd written with a fella in America called Rick Jude had been pitched to Meatloaf, and he eventually recorded my song. So, and I remember thinking, it was almost the vision, it was almost the story, but there was so many kind of wheels and wheels. And then a few months before lockdown, just to end that kind of trippy story. My mate from the stories, Andy, bought a piano, and he said, "Oh, can you help me move this piano?" And years ago, I was a piano removal man. So I said, "You ain't going to move it, mate. We're old now, and your arms are like knots in cotton. We ain't going to move this piano." So I said, "Let me call my friends from the old piano shop." So I called them, and the guy, Nick, who runs the place, and it's expanded now. It's a great place, and they've done really well. And they got this big warehouse. So Nick met me, and he'd looked the same, like he looked like 30 years ago, whatever. And I was like, "How do you do that?" And he said, "Good life." And so he said, "Do you remember that time when we were?" I used to sing all the time. I don't bother anymore because I do as a job. I used to sing all the time. And when we were moving pianos, I was singing, and this woman called Nick and said, "Hey, that boy's got a really good voice. I hope he does something with it." And he remembered, and he said, "God, I wonder if that woman ever saw you on the telly or playing Jesus or anything." I said, "Oh yeah, that's funny." And he said, "Hey, come and look at this warehouse. We now buy pianos that lots of famous people own." So he showed me a piano that Queen Victoria had, and he showed me a piano that Andrew Lloyd Webber had, which I thought that was amazing. And then he showed me a piano, this beautiful grand piano, Steinway, beautiful thing. And he said, "Oh yeah, this came out of Abbey Road Studio 3. And I worked out that it was the piano that I was auditioned on by Andrew and Jim. And I had a flipping moment where I almost kind of lost balance again, like I did back in the day." And I thought, what is all this? What's it mean? What does it mean, Tony? Please help me.
That is it. Would Sarah like to come in here on this one first? Then I'll give my opinions.
You help Sarah.
I don't know if I can help with that. I mean, I love those kinds of experiences, and I think that for me, whenever those sorts of things happen, I feel like happy because it feels like I'm on the right path. When that level of synchronicity kind of comes into your life, you feel like there's a certain magic and illusion in the world that I find exciting. So yeah, I love all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, because it is, isn't it? It's if it's a kind of the glimpse at the inner workings. In many ways, it reminds me of the idea in The Wizard of Oz when you look behind the screen and you see the workings. There's that famous, or thinking more that famous esoteric painting of the guy sticking his head through the firmament and seeing the workings of the universe behind. And it's as if the universe is telling you something in some way, and as if it's kind of nudging you along in some direction or something. Now, I'd argue that in terms of my model of understanding of the world, the understanding of how quantum physics work and everything else as well, it seems to me that it's giving us evidence that we live our life multiple times, and that this is not the first time you've lived this life nor the last time, and that we subliminally remember the lives we've lived before. I would argue, for instance, that I have something called the Damon Eidolon dyad, and the idea that within all of us there are two personalities. There's the Eidolon, which is the in-game, in-simulation consciousness that lives just one life and dies. Then there is the daemon, which is your immortal game player that plays your life many, many times. And occasionally there is leakage over from the dominant to non-dominant hemisphere of the brain across the corpus callosum, where the Eidolon suddenly acquires the knowledge and the perceptions of the daemon. And when that happens, we have all kinds of breakdowns in the reality we live within. Because if our reality is, as I believe it is, basically made up of information, and that everything we perceive in fact is digital, we'll get the judders and we'll get the changes and we'll get the overlaps. Now with you, I think what is happening here is that you're clearly very, very sensitive to these things, and they seem to come through to you in some way. Like, for instance, the argument could be that because you've lived your life many times, you notice that piano so precisely when you first saw Andrew Lloyd Webber, because your future memory of it, which you've already experienced, you'd have experienced that piano in your own future. And that then feeds back that mechanism of recognition into the past, but it still doesn't explain the linkages with Meatloaf. I mean, that vision is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
can you explain again? It came to you, was it a kind of a hypnagogic imagery? Can you explain again? Did it just appear in front of you?
That's exactly what it was. I was in a kind of a hypnagogic state. I was kind of listening to the lecture, kind of looking out the window, you know, just in a space of no space, I think, and just looking, and then this eyes went blurry, which I never, you know, I thought something was wrong, you know, and then it kind of it looked like I was looking at it on an old TV as well. It was in color, but it looked, you know, if the contrast had been changed, you know, on an old TV, you'd have the contrast thing. It was like something was not quite right with it. But it was and I remember having the sensation of the kind of room as well, like the smells and it was very kind of odd. It was a very,
so it was
very
totally synesthetic then, wasn't it? It was totally multi-sensual in the sense of how you're perceiving it. Do you recall whether there was were the colours normal, or were there any tinges to the colours at all?
They looked as if it was like an old film, like an old. It was a bit like watching. I was a big fan of Happy Days. It was like watching Happy Days. Oh. So the colours were kind of like a Technicolor thing, but kind of muted as well. Technicolor, but the contrast was messed with. Okay. It was not, you know. And I've looked into stuff. You know, there's lots of stuff in the conspiracy realm about remote viewers who looked into and they had, like, I think Gordon Cooper was talking about, they had a thing that they could look into, and they went and viewed the crucifixion and all of that. When I read that years later, I thought, God, that sounds very much like what it was kind of off a bit. And there was a brilliant TV show on recently on BBC called Devs. Did you see Devs?
Oh, Devs, yes, exactly.
But it was almost like that. It was almost like, because I think that was based on some of that kind of conspiracy stuff, or that kind of folkloric remote viewing.
The idea of the simulation argument again. Because the reason I'm asking this is a previous guest on this show is Graham Nichols. Well, Graham Nichols has been on 3 times now. And one of the things that Graham and I are always fascinated in is what he calls the Cyrillian effect. And it's when Graham has a hypnagogic experience, an out-of-body hypnagogic experience, he knows that it is a future experience, i.e. precognitive, because everything seems to switch towards the blue. Everything seems to be tinged in blue. And whenever he has these experiences, he knows if it's blue, that it's a content of his own future. Whereas if it's normally coloured, he knows he's seeing something that's contemporary to what he's feeling now. Now, these hypnagogic and hypnopompic images have intrigued me for a long time, purely and simply because I get them. And when I've had them, I find them extraordinary. I mean, the first time it happened to me, I was in an office at work. When I was working for UK and Airline out of Stansted Airport. I was in my office and I was working on the computer. And these things are so vivid that you know, you can see them now. I can almost reproduce it in my mind's eye. And I'm working on the computer, and then suddenly I'm not in the room. And I'm looking down, I'm in a tree, and I'm looking down. And as I look down, I see there is an elderly gentleman, and he's reading a newspaper. And I can see it now. It's so extreme. And again, as you say, it was kind of multi-sensual. I could smell the tree around me. And I could smell petrol fumes, which I thought was weird because I seemed to be in a park. And then I look up, and I hear a siren. And I look up, and there's this huge square. And in the far end of the square, there's an ambulance going down the far end of the square. And I know it's somewhere in Latin America, and I think it's Buenos Aires. Okay. And then it disappears. It's kind of, as you say, it's kind of an overlay image. You seem to be sticking your head into a virtual reality simulation that you pull your head into, and you go, oh, look at that. And then 3 or 4 days later, it happened again. And this time, it was even stranger. The first one, I think I was a bird looking down. But the second one, I'm looking up through a glass table, and an elderly woman is putting a cup down onto the glass table, and I'm looking through it, and I think I was a cat looking through the table at the woman. And again, I could smell the coffee. You know, I woke up and smelled the coffee. And you go, what was that? And it's suddenly just a breakthrough into somewhere else, some other perception. Is it remote viewing? Is it something else? But what you were doing there was you were attuning into a memory that somebody had that you were not going to be told about until your own future. So there was this kind of doubling effect, wasn't there? You know, of extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And it's when these things happen to people and you end up thinking, I can't even begin to tell to other people about that because they never believe.
That's right. And that's why, you know, I'm slightly nervous about sharing it today because it sounds so bonkers. You know, and as I said, my close, because we have a group that does, you know, consciousness exploring stuff. We like to call it a magical group in a kind of a, just for a name, but we do stuff with electronic voice phenomena. We've had incredible results with that.
Can you tell us more? Can you tell us more about your work with EVP then?
Well, like a lot of people, I read the Skull Experiment book and I was very intrigued by that. And there's a lot of controversy about that now. And, you know, and
we had a previous, by the way, Steve, we had a previous guest on the show who was a witness to a lot of the Skull Experiment, which was quite intriguing as well.
Well, I studied with a woman called Jill Peirce, who was like a shaman, and she does voice work. And she's married to Rupert Sheldrake. So I've got to speak to Rupert a lot about lots of stuff. And he was one of the witnesses who was at the Skull Experiment. And Rupert is not a liar. He just isn't. And I called him and asked him, you know, personally, did that happen? Because he claimed that like a disembodied hand kind of come across and and he kind of touched the hand and it was cold to the touch, right? So I asked him straight out, I said, did that happen? And he said, that happened. So, you know, you can only, and I believe that he believed that he had that experience, whether it happened in reality, who knows? But he believed, like I believe I've had these experiences myself, whether they did happen or not, you know, they happened to me. So is that real? I'm not sure, whatever. But so we took the Skull Experiment kind of model really, and for every week for, you know, a couple of years, we met at a specific time and did like old school kind of seance stuff where the room was blacked out and we recorded some stuff and we had hundreds and hundreds of voices that turned up. Were they disembodied voices? Were they kind of
were you recording them? You were recording them or what? How did...
And all I'd say was we didn't record them under scientific scrutiny. We did it for kind of to see if this stuff is kind of can work, right? So we didn't there was no kind of Faraday cage, or we didn't kind of isolate stuff. So, you know, people could, and it might be that some were stray radio waves or TV, you know, it could have been that. But there were a couple of occasions we have, within our group, we have people who claim to be mediums, and they certainly display attributes that they can kind of communicate with something and get information, because I've been witness to it and it's happened to me. They've done stuff with, you know, with myself that seemed to show that they had some ability. So one of the guys, Martin, and I'm not a big proponent, not that I don't believe it, but the idea of a walk-in or an idea of channeling, it's not really my thing. It's not that it doesn't happen. I'm sure it does, and there's a load of kind of evidence, if you like, that has happened, but it's not my thing. But one evening, this was deep into kind of our research, really. We the room, about an hour into the kind of, we did a meditation first, and then we kind of attuned, and we all kind of had the right intention. We did it in the kind of Skull Experiment kind of way. The room was dark. There was just a tiny light, and we had the machine recording, and this kind of, all I can describe as this kind of presence, this kind of thickness in the air, and we all felt it. It was like all of a sudden there was a blanket put over the room, and it was just very strange, like being in cotton wool or something. And then I had the overwhelming desire to kind of start speaking as if I was channeling something, and I'm thinking to myself, my kind of rational brain's going, you don't really believe in this stuff, dude. What's going on here? But I had this overwhelming, I was fighting the urge not to say anything. And a second later, Martin started speaking in this kind of strange voice. So that it was very interesting. We got it all recorded if everyone listened to all of that, Anthony. It was very interesting. So my takeaway from that was that there was some sort of interaction with something that certainly was trying to get my attention, and then just kind of went to Martin. But on another occasion, a voice, and we nicknamed him the Geordie Man because it was a male voice. It was very you could hear it very clearly. They would call it a Class A EVP, if you like. And he came back on several weeks, and we recorded little snippets. There wasn't any long conversations like is it the Cardosa?
Oh yeah, Cardosa, the Italian lady. Yes,
it was nothing as clear as that. But
yeah, myself and Irvin Laszlo featured her quite a lot in our book, The Hidden Year.
Very interesting stuff. Very, very interesting. But this one day, our friend Nikki, who's also a medium, or definitely she's very sensitive. She said, "Oh, I felt something on my cheek." And on the tape at that exact time, it says I kissed her. So either it was just a strange coincidence, of a stray radio wave, but it was very interesting timing. So that's all I can say about that. But there was a definite.
So what did you do? You just left a tape running while you did the seance, and a tape was just running in the background.
Right. And then I transferred it to my computer, and then I went and scrutinized it with a little bit of software that I had.
Because that's intriguing, isn't it? I mean, the skeptics would say it's pareidolia, and that we are attuned to hear things.
And I agree with some of that, Anthony. But some of it,
yeah, exactly.
It was not pareidolia. It's not that. You
can
hear it.
I know that it's not. That you could turn around to somebody else and say, "What did you hear then?" If it was pareidolia, the people would interpret it differently, but they don't. They hear the same things, and they're kind of fleeting voices that we hear. And again, using the discussion here of when you're in hypnagogic and hypnopompic states. I mean, I hear voices when I'm in that state. And there's sometimes even nonsense things are said, that you think, what? And I always found it quite strange because you're aware of the things that are being said, but it's as if they're in your periphery senses somehow. You can't really focus in on them, because if you do, it disappears, doesn't it? You've got to almost draw them in and pretend you're not seeing the images until they get into your visual field somehow. And I'm sure there is something very powerful in this phenomenon. And something that myself and two associates are working on is what we're calling the egregorial, and the idea that egregores, and these are sentience that can be drawn through somehow when we are open to them. But they're kind of being created by us, but not. And it's a very difficult idea to get across to people, that we are being used in some way, but these beings are us, in a bizarre way. And we're discussing, for instance, there's Skull was a classic example. A lot of the things that were happening in Skull were very, very strange. And the group of individuals that were seemingly trying to communicate from elsewhere to the Skull group. Yeah. And there was a lot of parallels between that and something called Imperator and Rector, which took place, I think, in about the 1890s. Then you had the cross correspondences that were done by members of the SPR. And it seems when you open yourself to these things seem to come through as if there's kind of a thin veneer between this reality and another reality. And in many ways that they're trying to communicate with us,
I think so. We definitely had that sense. Definitely. Because the more we got into it, and we were communicating with knocks in a very classic kind of seance-y way, give us a knock, bosh, give us 2 knocks, bosh, but it was all of that going on. And it was almost, but I tell you what was really interesting, there was, and I remember reading something in, who wrote the Real Magic? Who wrote Dean Radin? Was it Dean Radin wrote Real Magic?
Okay. Yeah, it's not a book I recognise by Radin, but I'm sure it was, yeah.
he was talking about the, because I am kind of skeptical as well, even though I've had some of these weird things go on, I'm kind of like, well, I want a bit more, or I don't know. So I'm always kind of looking for the out, really, and go, well, that was just whatever. But some of the stuff has just been so weird. But I remember reading something in his book, and it was something to do with when I think he was arguing there's enough evidence now, scientific research into psi phenomena, to say that it is actually a thing, and it does occur, right? So I'm interested in that. And then he was saying when money is spent on a research, facility, if you like, or they set up an experiment, it only seems to work when there's jeopardy. It only seems to work when the research money is going to go, or it's almost like there needs to be some sort of jeopardy in the conversation for it to kind of occur. And during we did this research in 2 different places, and in the first one, where we had a load of stuff happen, there was always jeopardy. There was always a bit of argy-bargy and a bit of aggro to do with the guys who were renting the place, and there was always a bit of grit there. When we went to the other place, which was lovely and harmonious, and it was all peace and love and kind of incense, we had nothing, absolutely nothing.
That is very intriguing, isn't it? Because I'm sorry to jump in here, but there's ideas buzzing around my head. This is very intriguing because, as you probably know, there was the Philip experiment that took place in 1970-71 in Toronto, where a group of people created an entity called Philip Aylesford. And the idea was that, they created a whole backstory of this guy. He was a Catholic nobleman in the 17th century, fell in love with a gypsy. His wife couldn't accept it. He committed suicide and everything else as well, but he never really existed. And they had raps and knocks and everything. But it was interesting that research group felt that they had a better response when they felt relaxed and happy, and they'd sing songs together and they'd tell jokes and everything else as well. And it seemed that they're creating this kind of egregorial feeling of collectiveness, which then generates this additional spirit that is created by the collective, and the way in which we can collectively create something greater than ourselves. But your point is also a very valid one, the point about jeopardy, because I'm immediately reminded of your point you were making earlier on about the problems with the club. Because again, there was a feeling of jeopardy there, wasn't there? Yeah, so absolutely. We had almost 2 parallel things here. Sarah, have you any thoughts on that as well?
There was a few things that I wanted to bring up during the course of your conversation. One of them was in terms of visualizations. Like, I've had those experiences where you seem like suddenly able to see from another perspective in another country or whatever it is, and it's like a hyper fantastic. People can be aphantastic or aphantic and have hyperphantasia, where they have super fantastic visual imagery and are able to conjure up really detailed images. And the other thing that I'm interested in on the subject of culpas and egregores is like Steve being a performer and how it feels to have been crucified 400 times. And I went to drama school myself, and for a lot of my youth, I felt like I was in a film or in a dream. And it was only really when I had my kid that I became a bit more grounded. And I think there was something about that made me really grounded. Whereas before, I remember, because I've always been really into lucid dreams as well, part of me felt like I wasn't really connected to the real world. And I remember once, after a long period of loads and loads of really intense lucid dreams and really long sleeping periods as well, someone stopped me and asked me for directions in the middle of like Bexhill down here on the south coast. And I thought, I don't know whether this world is real at all. And I had this total sense of being in a Matrix type of situation. And when I was a kid, I was really into making films and writing film scripts and imagining characters. And it was like I could almost split off parts of my personality to inhabit the world of this psychic creation of mine. And I wonder, I know personally for me, I know that being crucified 400 times would have a dramatic impact on my psyche. So do you think it had an impact on you?
That's a hell of a question. So I think a couple of things. I think going back to liminality, theatres are naturally liminal places anyway. They're places where we literally make stuff up and then trick us into believing that that's going on in the moment. So it's shamanic and it's liminal, and the fact that people come, something's created and grown and exists, and then everyone goes away.
So it's like an arena for initiation, isn't it? A theatre.
It's a very magical.
Theatre.
Yeah, it's an initiation of this crucible, like magical space. So put on top of that, even though it's within a framework of a kitsch 1970s musical, that the idea of being crucified is Jungian in its archetypal nature. So, you know, and I've spoken to people, and I remember taking it seriously, you know, that people believe this, whether you believe it happened or not, or believe Jesus existed or not. Tulpa-like or egregoria-like, they're 2,000 years of people projecting onto that archetype, which, you know, people could argue it was borrowed from a, you know, Odin on the world tree or previous civilizations' archetypes. It's all kind of comes from the same kind of place, I would have thought. I was definitely aware that some stuff was going on, and it was almost like I felt like I was burning up lifetimes of karma in a strange way, and I just went with it and thought, well, let's use it. But I'll tell you one, and I've shared this story once before, and I shared it yesterday with Tony. This is a weird story, right? And it sounds bonkers, but I remember about halfway into the run, and you'll know, going to drama school, sometimes people are into it and everybody's moving like one animal or one machine, and sometimes people are not into it, and the performance can fall flat. And I'm a big believer in the audience plays a participatory role in what goes on always anyway, and sometimes it's a good exchange and sometimes it's not. Halfway through the run, it was all on. Everyone was moving, you know, the thing was happening. And during the crucifixion scene, now I had a crown of thorns that was set up, so it had 2 bits of blood that kind of came down. When you pressed it into my head, the kind of fake blood came down and ran into my eyes, and it looked horrific, but it was beautiful as well. So of course I'm on the cross, so I can't, the only thing I do is blink. So I'm blinking the blood out of my eyes, given the lines of the crucifixion. And remember, I told the story about being on stage in the college production and thinking, I'm going to do this again. It was just a knowing. So I'm on the cross and I'm giving the lines. I'm looking out into the auditorium, and I think I see a demon's face in like a classic. And I remember the distinguishing features were sharp pointed teeth. And I'm thinking, oh, what is going on? So I close my eyes and blink. It's still there, and then it kind of fades and dissipates, as you said before, Tony. So I come down, and I'm very shaken up by this, thinking, has somebody slipped me a Mickey Finn in my water? Am I tripping? Am I tired? Have I gone insane? All of these things are going through my mind. So I came home and I tell my girlfriend, my wife, and she's like, look, it's obviously tiredness, and maybe it was the light kind of refracting off the blood stuff in your eye. I was like, yeah. So I squared that up, put it away, but it was very, very odd. Years later, I'm researching into the history of the Lyceum Theatre, and it turns out that a famous actor at the turn of the century is a guy called Henry Irving, and his business manager at the Lyceum Theatre was Bram Stoker, who loved Henry so much and was so inspired, so the story goes, by his performance in Faust, that he got the inspiration for Dracula at the Lyceum Theatre. And in fact, the first place that Dracula was ever performed was the Lyceum Theatre. So was there an egregore, a tulpa created? Was there in fact a genius loci, you know, like a spirit of the place that exists within that liminal space? The liminality, the fact that 2,000 people or whatever it was that the Lyceum holds were mesmerized literally at a very violent crucifixion scene, which was beautiful as well. Were they kind of in a kind of state of suspended disbelief? Was there in fact a veil that was lifted at that point between this world and the next? all of those things could have been. And I didn't know at the time that Bram Stoker had anything to do with the Lyceum Theatre, which, and you go, what? And we're only a couple of 100 yards away from one of the many plague pits in London. So all of that kind of psychogeography, all of that kind of history would, and if you go with the stone tape theory, you are within a magical realm that stuff was being created. So why wouldn't I see a 20-foot face of some sort of vampire in the middle of an auditorium and having a crucifixion? Why not? Maybe it did happen.
That's a fascinating analysis of so many features there, aren't there? The idea of, you say, the collective anticipation, the way in which theatre has this strange magical feel it's almost disassociation, and it's a disassociation of belief as well, because you have to believe that what you're seeing on the theatre is really happening. And I imagine the emotional, and I think Sarah's point is an incredibly valid one, that the trauma of you having to do that archetypal being on the cross that many times and going through it. And of course, as I recall reading many years ago, the very positioning of the body on a cross is there to asphyxiate you effectively, which means that you're in a state of anoxia or hypoxia, with oxygen starvation, because even if you're just acting, you're still spread out in that way, aren't you? So the oxygen will still be a problem with breathing. How you managed to do that many times. It must have been so powerfully choreographed. Were you actually raised up on the cross as well when they did it? Yeah. Really? So you were... Wow.
It was beautifully staged and beautifully directed. And the cross was on stage all through the performance. And in fact, they had to change the cross in the beginning. The original cross that was on stage, I ended up carrying, but it was too heavy, and it was actually breaking down my scapula. But so when they thought, well, we kind of broken Jesus's, really, they changed it, and they kind of did a switcheroo right at the end, but they kind of put it into like a special metal metal sheath thing, and I was carried, and it was after the whipping, which was, in our version, was extremely violent but also very balletic and beautiful, and so I was covered in blood because they had this chalice on stage, and everyone kind of took a handful, and on the whips they kind of smeared my body with blood. It was brutal, but just sensational.
But as you say, so shamanic, isn't it? The whole point of the shamanic journey is the dismemberment of the shaman, and you were doing it every night.
We did, yeah, about 400 times, and so yeah, I was definitely aware, and I'm, at that point I was into kind of magical thinking and reading lots of books on magic and stuff, and there is something in it without a doubt.
Yeah, I heard Paul Nicholas talk in an interview, because he was the first person to play Jesus when it was taken to the theatre, and he was saying that he didn't know what it was going to feel like the first time he did it, and he realised how naked and vulnerable and upset he was when he was actually up there, and he just burst into tears.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. In fact, I remember during we had 8 weeks of rehearsal, and he just broke a memory of when I was put on the cross. Loads of people just started crying. It was heavy. Instead of rush of emotion there myself. Yeah.
Because when we spoke a few months ago about a lot of these things, we were talking about Ted Neely and about. I was profound. I'm not religious. I never have been, but I was profoundly affected by the movie of Jesus Christ Superstar, and that opening sequence where he's on the top of the hill and he's coming in from different angles. They must have filmed it by helicopter. Yeah. I think is just absolutely powerful. It really is almost visceral in its power, but that's nothing to doing it on stage time and time and time again, and it must have been exhausting. Hard work.
It was hard work. Not so much in the voice, because when you're young, you can do loads of stuff. And I didn't, I kept myself in shape and didn't drink for a year and all that sort of stuff, and tons of water. But the physicality of getting chucked around on stage, I was busted up. And I remember once I cut my knee being thrown to the floor, and it became infected, and I had like a temperature of 100, and because they'd sold a bunch of tickets on a TV performance, I couldn't have the night off. So I was on stage shivering, tripping out. It wasn't the night that I saw this thing, but I remember thinking, I got to get through another 2 hours of this. But we did it. You do, and you just get on with it and do it. I tell you, total respect to people who do theatre day in and day out, man. It's just it's a very tough gig. It's tough mentally as well. You got to, and it is Groundhog Day. Definitely is that.
Yeah, because that must be that strange feeling of you're doing it again and again, and it's curious. Sarah, are there any comments coming through in the chat room?
Yeah, someone asked, I can't see, hang on, I'm the wrong side of the questions, but someone asked here, did your experiences change once you did start experimenting with psychedelics? I think someone wrote something along those lines.
Magic mushrooms is what I've done. So psilocybin, and I've never done acid. I want to try DMT at some point. I'm really going to try that. Only in she won't mind me saying, my wife, before we had kids, we were doing mushrooms on Christmas. We used to love doing it on Christmas. Christmas night, we get rid of the family and we trip watching Christmassy stuff. God, it's a memory. I've done it for 16 years. That's how long we haven't done it, since Izzy was born. But I remember one of the psychedelic things we had one of the, I had this piece of art on the wall, and in my trip, it changed into my friend's face. And then Tracy said, "Oh my God, look, it's Darren." And I was like, whoa. So we had a psychic trip connection. So she saw something that I was seeing. So that was interesting. Not because I knew I was in the trip. I knew I was in the trip, so it didn't. I kind of expected things to get strange. But when you're not in a trip, unless there's research into whether our blood is getting flooded with DMT at the moment of death and all of this, and Penny's talked about that, Tony, a lot. And unless during these moments, like when I was on the cross and seeing the kind of face, whether my body was being flooded by DMT or I was getting flooded.
It's quite fascinating here. Dave Phillips has made a point, and it was something I was thinking as well. It reminds me of he says it reminds me of the Native American Sundance and them getting visions from it without the pain. And it reminded me, of the famous film A Man Called Horse, where Richard Harris
and he's a massive synchronicity.
Yeah.
Massive synchronicity.
Go on.
The trip I was thinking about when we saw the face, I was flicking through the channels, and A Man Called Horse was on when he was being raised up by that was in my memory like 2 minutes ago. Jesus, that's brilliant.
That is the kind of thing that, like, somebody's just walked over your grave. I mean, it probably is, because if we remember that scene so powerfully. But again, it is, isn't it? It's trying to facilitate ecstasy out of the body. The idea of the pain. You go through the pain, and there's like the flagellants, isn't it, in medieval times, walking through the cities, and as the Shia Muslims do when they do their commemoration of the killing of, was it Ali or whatever, I can't remember. But the idea that you can, through pain, you can take yourself somewhere else. St. Teresa of Avila, I think, did it as well. So, but what you're doing, and I think the real point, and I'd never really realised it before, was the archetypes. And you hit upon it, that you were doing one of the biggest archetypes every night.
Yeah. And it's funny, any kind of musical I've done, I've always died in it as well.
Really?
So the death and rebirth thing has been a big thing.
Which other musicals have you done that have things like that?
I remember dying in that every night. I had to lie back in a kind of a crucifixion upside down thing. It was like it was like the archetype of the hanged man. On the barricade, it was one of the kids in the barricade, and I remember dying upside down. It was ridiculously painful. So it was that whole thing about the and then I did something else and I died in that, and any kind of theatrical stuff, I die all the time. So the death and rebirth thing is a big thing, a big kind of motif in my life.
A friend of mine stopped being an actor because he was always playing sickly kids, and then he got cancer as a teenager. And he was sure that it was because he was constantly given these like sickly kid roles. And he told me he spent some ridiculous amount of hours, like 6 hours, with his throat slit on a mirror once in a film. And he just decided he could never do it again after that.
Wow. Yeah, I think I got 2 points for that. One funny one, and what that gentleman said just then, Tony. I used to think, when I was trying to square up the experience of the face, I used to think it was almost shamanic as well, in that we've been through you're in a musical, you've learned the music so well, you've actually forgotten the music, you're just doing it kind of automatically. So that's almost like the drum of the shaman's drum, and the music is pounding, so you're almost kind of out of body sometimes, and sometimes during a show, and I've talked to other actors and stuff, they kind of, it's like when you're driving a car, sometimes think, how did I get here? You're doing a show, you're thinking, go, am I in this act already? What happened to the last 25 minutes? But the other thing about what you were saying there, Sarah, is because I played the thing so much, and motions can get locked in muscles. I remember I was painting my wife's auntie's house, and Elaine Page's musicals was on, right? And on that show from the Ahoy, Tony, we're talking about, the one when I'm on the big stage, I come down and I get it back up and I'm crying. And I used to do that pretty much all the time on stage, because you get into a routine. And initially, from an actory point of view, I had to find kind of touchstones in my life, stuff that wasn't very nice to happen to me and so on, and to get to that emotional place. And whenever I like for a trick, then I would kind of think of that thing and it would take me back there instantly. So I get a bit of kind of emotional kind of response, Sarah, from being an actress. So I was painting the floor of the skirting boards, and Elaine Page was playing Gethsemane, the song we're talking about from Superstar. And I happened to be painting the skirting board, and it got to the big note, and I stood up and I just started bursting into tears, because that was the moment in the song where I burst into tears. So it was still trapped within my muscles and trapped within my body. And I'm standing there painting, thinking, weeping, listening to myself on Elaine Page radio show, thinking, what the hell? What am I doing?
Well, that's
but it's interesting.
It really reminds me, I've got a friend from school, Tara McDonald, who's a really well-known like dance diva now, and does loads of like Ibiza hits and things like this. But she was in musicals when we were at school together. She started off at Italia Conti, and then when she went to the Brit School with me, and she was in Les Mis. And I remember she always used to let me have a +1 when she went to these gigs. And so I was often in a car with her late at night, driving along these like little tiny country roads in Kent, where she lived. And one night she was really tired, because those people like just work nonstop. She used to be in like a different country every single day. And she was driving along this little country road, and she was completely in a trance-like state. She wasn't looking where she was going at all. And she said to me that she saw a demon in front of her, and its tongue was rolling out from in between its teeth. And she was just completely in like pilot mode.
Wow.
Because this is it, isn't it? You must suffer from, as an actor, and both of you having done this, that you must somehow lose yourself in the character. That you almost, it's like a dissociative personality thing, isn't it? Because you have to, like method acting, you have to be the character.
I haven't done much of it, to be honest, Tony, and I'm a because of where I came from, I've still got imposter syndrome. I still haven't got a clue what I'm doing. I'd love to explore acting more and take some classes. I really would. It's on my list to do over the next few years, I think. I'd love to give it a whirl. But you know more about that, Sarah, but I think...
Oh, no, I don't. I went to drama school and then realised that I definitely didn't want to do acting, and I wanted to be a film director instead, or a writer. So I'm writing a book, so my plan is that I'll get my book made into a film, and then I'll be able to do it. But yeah, acting, I was completely turned off from acting after being at school learning drama. I'm too much of a control freak, I think.
Isn't this, yeah, I'm with you. Isn't the story with Daniel Day-Lewis when he was playing Hamlet, the famous scene where he had the skull? Didn't he see his recently passed away dad in the skull, and he put it down and walked off and never went back on stage? I think that's a story.
Well, one of the stories I really liked about acting, and it was something I was going to cite last week when we had the show on Synchronicity, which is a story I've heard many times, and it really, really amazes me. And it was to do with the guy that took off Hannibal Lecter.
Tony Hopkins.
And of course, Tony Hopkins, again, it's quite interesting. Anthony Hopkins in the movie Magic.
Oh, I love that book.
Takes off a ventriloquist guy with a ventriloquist dummy, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And that was based upon the film we were talking about earlier in Dead of Night.
Very great.
So we're going round in a circle here. But he tells a story that he was in a play called The Girl from Petrushka, and he needed to find a copy of The Girl from Petrushka because he wanted to read the novel. And he went to the local library and he couldn't find one anywhere. And he was literally in Leicester Square, wandering around soon afterwards. And he sees a book on one of the benches in Leicester Square. And he goes over and he picks it up, and it's a copy of The Girl of Petrushka.
Oh my God.
And he thinks, what is the chances of that? And he then goes and he phones up the guy who wrote the book and said, I managed to find a copy of your book in the centre of Leicester Square. Because he was so amazed by it, he thought, I need to tell the writer. And he phones up the writer, and the writer says, oh, that's interesting. He said, what edition is it? And it was the first edition. And then the guide suddenly turned around to him and said, can you open the front page? And he said, are there certain markings in the front page? And he said, yes, there are. And he said, you're not going to believe this. That was my copy, and I lost it about 5 years ago. And you go, what the hell is going on there? It's bizarre. And that's a much cited case, and you think, is there something to do with the magical world of theatre and something to do with performance and everything else? Which leads me on to something I've always wanted to ask somebody like yourself. Where do your songs come from? How do you write your wonderful songs? And I know you were telling me earlier on you're working on a new group of songs at the moment with a new group you're playing, a band you're working with. But what happens? What's the process?
That's interesting, Tony. I think during the lockdown, a lot of my friends haven't been writing songs, and I've done loads of songwriting. During the lockdown process, this Zoom has kind of kept it all going, and it works really well for songwriting. The last few years, I've done a few songs on my own. The process for me is I usually come up with a melody, or I used to usually come up with a melody and then find some words to go around it. Recently, it's been lyrics coming first and then writing. Sometimes they just come all at once. Sometimes you have to wrestle them to the mat and put them in a chokehold. But I think my songwriting now, my solo stuff, is definitely moving in a more spiritual way, to a more spiritual place. I don't know what exactly is happening. I've got a little idea of a song cycle based on the kind of the vision-y thing I had years ago of the me in a Meatloaf thing that came again a few years ago in a different. I saw something else, and I saw myself at the Venice Biennale. My dad's Venetian. He's got dementia at the moment, so that's an interesting watching how that is progressing and how his memory's failing. But in my vision, I was doing a music or a piece of music and visual art installation at the Biennale. I had no intention of doing that ever, but that's what I saw. So it's almost like I'm back engineering a story to maybe take me to that place and seeing what it is. So I've got a little idea about a song cycle that's to do with Tryweryn, which was a village in mid Wales, it got flooded by Liverpool Council. They flooded the whole area to get water for the docks. and for the industry that was going on. So there's like this magical idea of the church is still under the water, and I hadn't heard about it, and I feel quite embarrassed. It's quite a nationalistic Welsh thing, and my both kids have gone through Welsh medium school, and my little boy did a project in school about it. And it entranced me, this lovely idea of maybe, you know, the psychogeography of the place, that people are still singing in the church, and there's folklore now that the bell can still be heard. So I got really, and the idea of Venice, where my dad's from, so half of my blood is from Venice really, is sinking, and this idea of the village was sunk underneath the water. So there's something about the water and breaking the waves, and so I'd love to put a song cycle together and see what that is. So that's a little project for the future. But and I'm excited about that, because it's, you know, it's just percolating away, and because it came from that kind of strange vision, at some point it'll manifest in some way. I'm convinced of it. But I'm very interested in how people write and on what happens. I mean, there's the famous story about McCartney dreaming yesterday and calling it scrambled eggs or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. But and the magician and writer Alan Moore talks about is it idea space, or he talks about an actual place that we can go visit, get some ideas and bring them back. I kind of like that idea as well.
Well, I'm hoping at the future there's a mutual contact of Sarah and I's who has interviewed Alan Moore, and it would be wonderful to get him on the show. Because,
so interesting, indeed.
Yeah, such an interesting guy. Yeah, and how he decides his stories and creates his stories is very, very intriguing. And you know, the strange link with him and I via Sting, which is really quite weird.
Oh yeah.
John Constantine. And just to very much just quickly tell the story, he has a character called John Constantine, who is a Scouser living in London, and this guy, he decides he looks like Sting, and the reason he did this was that way back in the early 1980s, apparently Alan Moore used to have regular coffee in a coffee shop in Westminster. And he occasionally saw this guy, and he once heard him speak, and he spoke with a Scouse accent. And he decided this guy was so interesting, and he decided it was this character who looked vaguely like Sting that made him do the John Constantine thing. Now, the strange thing about this was he said this guy wore a very distinctive Burberry trench coat. I used to go to the coffee shop. I'm sure it's the same coffee shop in Westminster he describes in the early 1980s. And the curious thing is that the one thing I used to wear quite regularly was a very distinctive Burberry trench coat. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, and if you look at the drawings of John Constantine and you look at me, it's me as easily as it's Sting. And that sends shivers up my spine, because then there's wheels within wheels there that you don't even want to be going down, you know, because then you know that Sting wrote the album Synchronicity, and you're going.
Have you ever seen this play that Sting was in called Artemis 81? It's like a TV play.
No.
It's one of the best things I've ever seen on TV. It's amazing, and he basically plays a daemon.
Really? Because I remember him playing.
He's like an angel. He's a gay angel.
Yeah, because didn't he play? Because he was in Brimstone and Treacle.
Yeah.
And he plays a creepy character on that as well.
I'll check out Artemis 81. It's really esoteric and amazing.
Well, interesting point here is, again, with Synchronicity, is the next guest on the show is Paul Levy. And guess who wrote the foreword to Paul Levy's book?
Sting,
yeah. So we've got lots of wheels within wheels here that are taking place, you know, and, you know, because when Steve and I first met, you know, you just instinctively meet people, you know, that are just going to be part of your life. And, you know, and Steve's very much part of all this. And, you know, with our mutual interest and our mutual friend, Penny Sartori, who has also been a guest on this show, very, very intriguing. So Steve, what are your next what are you going to be up to? That you've got this new musical project that you're working on that you were telling me about that sounds very interesting.
I'm working with Andy Collins from The Stories and a guy called Pete Riley from your neck of the woods.
By the way, anybody, if you want to check out The Stories, it's Steve's country rock band, and I was playing it only yesterday, and wow. I just love that album, Beyond the Trees. It is
thanks, man.
Brilliant. Now, the other thing that Steve and I were talking about beforehand was about Liverpool music scene. So can you just explain your guy, and then I'll link in with something else here.
Yeah, Pete Riley is part of he's like a Liverpool stalwart. He was in a band called Treehouse back in the day. Toured America, signed to Atlantic Records, ended up touring America, was part of Edwin McCain's band now. He's a big artist in America, done loads of stuff. So we got together, we've known each other a few years, and I just love what Pete does. So Andy, Pete and I started a thing on Zoom at the beginning of the lockdown, just writing and finding out how we were doing and just a bit of therapy. And we got a couple of real good, strong songs straight away. So we came up to Liverpool and made a little video for that. Down by the Dock Road there's a big old studio rehearsal place. Oh, what's it called? Anyway, we went in there. I can't remember it.
Oh, no, this could be really creepy. If you can remember that, I think I know what it is, because I think I worked there for about a year.
Oh, of course. So I'll remember it now.
Okay.
And yeah, so we're just doing that and having a mess around with that. That's first songs on the radio down in Wales with BBC Radio Wales, which is very exciting, and a couple of other stations are playing it. And then carry on doing my own stuff. And a little thing has floated past my window. A couple of 3 actor friends of mine are possibly putting together like a producing house for new writers in South Wales and Swansea. And a brilliant synchronicity happened the other day through this. So we had a meeting, and it's all about, let's get some, because Swansea's very diverse, it's, multicultural, has been forever. So kind of represent some of those voices. So on a totally different conversation, I spoke with a friend of mine who works for the council. He works for comms for Swansea Council. And he said, oh, there's a blue plaque being put up in your school today. And I said, oh, who's that for? And it's to do with a woman called Jen Wilson, who's a writer and a jazz pianist. And she's been writing about women in jazz, especially in Wales, for years. She's fantastic. And she's my friend from school's mum. So I said, oh, what's that about then? He said, oh, she wrote this book called Freedom Music or Freedom Songs, which I've just ordered, because we were looking to get an idea of a great play to put on. He said, well, it's about this woman in the 1880s, went from Swansea over to Cincinnati in Ohio, and she helped the Underground Railway as it take some of the slaves out and all of that. And then some of the slaves came back to South Wales and shared their music and their jazz and their songs, and they kind of floated into the kind of Welsh male voice choir world, because I've always been interested why there's some spiritual kind of songs from America in the kind of songs of the Welsh male voice choir. And I always thought it was, well, they were down in the pit all week, and then they went to chapel and saying they were in the fields, and then they came to church. And probably is that kind of crossover. It's more to do with this bunch of people who came over and kind of brought their beautiful magic and their words. So I was like, wow, that'd be a brilliant play to write, a play with music. I thought, right, I'll write that down, get it sorted out. So I tell my friends, they're like, oh, it's a great idea. Yeah, get the book. We'll start the kind of process of trying to get the rights or whatever you do, because I'm new to this game. But I thought, yeah, that sounds great. So in a totally different part of my life, during lockdown, I've been helping friends with their vintage furniture business, because one of my other loves in life is kind of, decorating and all of that. I love it. Soft furnishings. I got a black belt in soft furnishings. So so the other day, my friend called, said, can you help me tomorrow? I've just bought some of this antique stuff. Can you kind of pick it up? I said, yeah. Turn up at this house. There's a woman there, and her father had recently passed away, and we were talking, and she dropped into the conversation. Oh, I'm a jazz singer. And I said to her, you don't know Jen Wilson, do you? And she said, oh yeah, she's my ex-mother-in-law. And then she said, oh my God, you're Steve. And I was like, yeah. And she knew I was, because in Swansea, some people know I am from singing. And I said, oh, I've just ordered Jen's book, and I'd love to kind of turn it to play. She said, well, I helped to do a load of research in that book. And I took that, we did like a précis like play, and we took it around to schools. And I'm like, what are the chances of that? What are the chances of that? So I'm like, oh, we'll be in touch, love. So it's a very strange old world, guys.
Good Lord, it's laid out for you, isn't it? I think that is definitely a path you're going to have to follow.
At some point, yeah, at some point.
Extraordinary, you know, and it's just watching the synchronicities all the time. Right, I'm aware that we're almost coming to the end now. Sarah, are there any other questions or burning questions that are out there that the guys are wanting to answer, or any observations that people have made?
Hang on, there's loads of questions and I can't see them on my laptop for some reason. There's 20 questions. Loads of people watching today.
Well, I know somebody, just very quickly, somebody here, Laurie Schmidt Schelling Drawl, has said, coincidentally, I watched a biopic about Meatloaf on the Reels TV channel last night.
Oh my God.
So Meatloaf is obviously there as well.
You know, when he recorded my song, guys, I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I might buy a house in the south of France. And we were invited. This is how idiotic I am sometimes. We were invited to a show when he played in Cardiff, and it was the year of the album release that my song was on, and the poor guy had a heart attack, so it was all cancelled. So yeah, so I'm like, yeah, poor thing. But he's good now. But all of that kind of great momentum with that song kind of went out the window. Maybe the kind of synchronicity was I nearly killed Meatloaf with a song. Maybe I nearly killed him with my song.
Like a bat out of hell, you know.
I'm going to kill Meatloaf with music.
Yeah, I'll do many things, but I won't do that. Yes, I won't kill Meatloaf with a song.
That's right.
I think you've got an idea for a song here. You know, I tried to kill Meatloaf with a song.
Yeah, I think it's going to be.
Yeah, because Jim Steinman also he died. Didn't he die recently?
He passed recently. I love Jim so much. He was such a lovely guy.
Because his songs are just such huge soundscapes, aren't they? They're just incredible pieces of writing.
Genius songwriter. He was into Wagner and he was into kind of pomp and his musical. A friend of mine, Rob, was in his musical. Fantastic singer, Rob Fowler. Incredible. They did a Bat Out of Hell, a musical, and I went thinking, oh God, what are they going to do with these songs for this? And it was just amazing, and every singer in it, especially Sharon and Rob, were just outrageous singers, just like the best. But I knew I was getting old because it was too loud. The show was too loud. I was like telling the sound guy, turn it down, mate. He said, you're too old. I was like, oh God. Because
you could see, couldn't you, right? You know, that Bat Out of Hell is really made for the kind of the crowd that would like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. You know, it's got that huge sweep to it and power to it with a sense of weirdness. I mean, that album cover and the artist who did the albums, very, very interesting artwork, you know, and this kind of powerful thing.
Todd Rundgren was involved in a lot of that as well. Did all the
Todd Rundgren. It doesn't surprise me. The very fact you say that, I'd say Todd Rundgren. Yeah, it's the same feel. I used to love one of his album covers used to kill me. The Whoop's Wrong Planet.
That's brilliant.
It's just and he's such a talented songwriter in so many ways. And he had that weird image when he had the big sideburns that used to dye in a different colour. Because we haven't even touched upon our mutual music taste.
That'll be for another chat.
I think definitely it will be, because there is so much in there in terms of the music. But guys, if you want to check out, you know, sort of really classic, good country rock with perfect harmonies. But Steve, am I right? You also went through a period where you were heavily into progressive music as well. Were you brought a progressive album as well?
I've done two by accident. I don't know much about prog, but I accidentally became a prog singer. A friend of mine, Rob Reed, who's well in the prog world, we put a band together called Chimpanzee, which was from the Simpsons episode when they did a musical on Planet of the Apes. And one of the songs was from chimpanzee to chimpanzee. So we thought, we'll have that. It's the stupidest name we could think of. And we just did this kind of album for ourselves. And it's heavily influenced in lots of kind of weirdness and the kind of...
So who was the major influence in prog rock for that then?
Well, for me, it's probably... Because I was never a massive progger. But I love Peter Gabriel. And I love, you know, the lamb from Genesis, the Genesis thing, but we kind of mashed up lots of different things. So it was kind of, it had some of, because Rob grew up listening to Yes and all of that stuff, and it was never my thing. And then we've got spoken word on it, and we've got kind of samples. You should check it out. We managed to get, we were allowed to use Tubular Bells as a sample. Mike Oldfield let us use it, and Taberna let us use a sample of The Lamb for one of our songs on our first album. They're two lovely albums. They're one of my favorite things I've ever done. So that's Chimpanzee.
The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, I never really got into. I mean, I was very much into earlier Genesis, like Foxtrot and Nursery Crime. Yeah. And I've also always been a huge fan of Yes, particularly because of the harmonies, I think.
Yeah, you'd love Rob Reed's band there. He's got a band called Magenta, and they're kind of like one of the new prog stuff. Yeah, it's
okay,
good.
I will check that out. Okay, well, we're getting towards the end now, so we're about to come to the end now. So very quickly then, how can people get hold of your details, your website and everything else as well? So that, because I'm sure there's going to be an awful lot of people here going to be checking your music out, I hope, because it's well worth checking out. So please, if you can let people know how they can check your stuff out.
If you check out Steve Balsamo Music, or come and try and find me on Facebook or Instagram or stuff like that. There's always some stuff going on. There's some posts of new stuff all the time. But yeah, and if you want to check out any theatre stuff, if you just put my name into YouTube, it'll come up with the Ahoy Gethsemane, which is if you're into that sort of stuff, it might float your boat.
Oh, it's absolutely mind-blowing. That it's just outrageously fantastic. I mean, I can't even believe the vibes that must have been coming from the audience for that whole thing. That was in Amsterdam, was it?
No, Rotterdam. That was
Rotterdam, was it?
Rotterdam.
I mean, what a venue! I mean, how many people were in there?
About 10,000 on that one, and because it was nerve-wracking for lots of reasons, but because I was the only non-Dutch person, and the Dutch musical theatre is really well thought of and well, attended, and they make stars out of people. So they're all the kind of top stars, and I was involved because I was working on a musical with Eric Wolfson, who was the writer with the Alan Parsons Project. So Eric wrote the musical based on Edgar Allan Poe. He was always fascinated with Poe. So we were in Amsterdam trying to sell the musical to a guy called Joop van der Ende, and he was the Ender of Endemol, very, very wealthy guy who kind of basically runs theatre in Holland, and look, he's got like theatres all over the world. So it was all a bit of a game to make that happen. But I'm so chuffed that it did, because they never did a recording of our theatrical version. A few things have turned up online with bits from the show, but they never recorded the whole show, which I can't actually understand. Even for their own archives, they never did. So that's basically one of the only things that exists of my time.
What a loss! Well,
extraordinary. I don't understand why they never did it, but they didn't do it. But it's one of those things.
Dear. Okay, well, thanks again, Steve. That was absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed it. And Sarah, thank you very much for your very capable assistance, as always. And thanks, guys, for listening in and watching, and your comments as well. Really good. This has been recorded, and it will be placed. It'll be up on Facebook straight away, and also it'll be up on my YouTube channel early tomorrow morning, probably, if not this evening, if I get the chance to try and get it up earlier, as the actress said to the Archbishop. I'll rephrase that one. But great, thanks everybody, and thanks for listening. I always manage to do that. At some stage, I will make the fantastic comment like that. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you very much, and we will see you next week. Thanks very much. Thank you.